The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
I want to bring in our SIG principal, the Honorable Leslie Ireland. Leslie's a board member at Citi and a former Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Treasury. Leslie, when we start talking about Shields Up, we really have a campaign on our hands to really get everyone out there aware of some of these challenges. And yet, it feels like there's always more to do. We heard from several presenters today about ransomware. We heard about, basically nation state actors all over our commercial and private sector operators globally, and whether it's domestic space or here. Now, what I'd love to do now is turn it over to you and get your thoughts on just how we've heard from industry on what the Shields Up means and some of your insights there.
Thank you very much. I welcome the chance to chat with you today and think it's a tremendous group that you and Suzanne have pulled together to talk about this full range of issues. I want to reiterate some of what others have said today and just say kudos to the U.S. government for the efforts that they're making towards increasing a public-private partnership, and footstop what others have said about having Chris Inglis and Ann Neuberger and Jen Easterly involved in this. I think most people may not understand that all of them not only have extensive experience at NSA, so they understand the threat, but they also have extensive experience in the government, in the private sector, where, Jen Easterly up at Morgan Stanley or Chris Inglis serving on the board of FedEx, and Ann Neuberger certainly at NSA working to support the defense industrial base with information assurance. So I think if you wanted a dream team to come in and really think about this and prioritize it, you've got it. Shields Up, I think, is a really important start, especially for the smaller to mid-sized companies who I think at this point, some frankly must be overwhelmed and flummoxed about what to do and to understand the threat that's out there. And it's a wonderful one-stop shopping, if you will, to get true insight into what the current threat landscape is. And as we heard from Rob Joyce this morning, that the Shields Up is augmented by what NSA and the FBI can be putting out there as well. So I think that there's a good body of information that's out there. I also think Shields Up is an important step. Every CISO should have a relationship with someone either in law enforcement or at CISA, because at some point, and we always say this, it's when, not if, there is a cyber event, they need to be able to turn to those people, both for help with the event, but also it's also an important avenue for information sharing. This may be an event that the government doesn't have insight into, and I like to tell people that you may think of the government and intelligence as a bit of a grab bag, but it's not. Many times the cyber events that we see are a reflection of access. They're not necessarily a reflection of what's really happening on the ground, and that can come from the private sector. So I think encouraging that level of cooperation is really, really critical at this point.
And when we had our earlier conversations to get ready for today, one of the things that we talked about is how this isn't just an IT solution challenge.
That's right.
And so I'd turn over to you to kind of highlight that.
Absolutely. As companies are approaching cybersecurity, I think it is vital that they look at it as an enterprise-wide threat. So why is that important? Why is it important to take it out of the IT department? First and foremost, I think it convinces people that everybody in that company is part of the defense of company assets. We hear that some 85 to 95% of breaches are the result of the human element. Well, the humans are what make up your company, and making sure they understand their role in the defense and their responsibility in the defense is really critical. I think the second part is it really allows a company to prioritize its investments. Matt, I'm sure you get the question a lot. How much should I be spending on cybersecurity? There is no answer. It depends upon the assets that you need to protect, and that you need to identify those assets, and then you need to prioritize your investments to achieve risk reduction in those threats against those assets. It thirdly allows you to identify the controls that you need to defend against your worst vulnerabilities. You know, controls are sometimes seen as a bad thing. It's like when you have a lawyer that tells you no. You want a lawyer who helps you get to yes. You've got an IT department who wants controls for a very good reason. And it allows employees outside of IT to understand that the controls are there and that they can actually help them with their business priorities. You know, Mario Andretti said, "It is amazing how many race drivers, even in the Formula One circuit, think that the brakes are there to slow the car down." Well, they're not. They're there so that you can take the car fast on the straightaway and control it in the curve that comes up. That's exactly what controls are. And companies need to embrace a culture where controls are a good thing, and rather than resisting controls. And the final point that I'd make on this, and I think Kelly Bissell brought up an excellent question, what about boards? I think increasingly you're going to see companies and boards held accountable for the governance that they provide on cybersecurity, and that taking that risk-based, enterprise-wide risk-based approach will be an important way to demonstrate the governance that they are employing.
Well, and just when we start talking about investment, let's talk about where the government is investing in some of these solution areas. And we talk about the National Risk Management Center at CISA, where they start talking about national critical functions. Where are those pinch points? Where are those systems of systems to where when we start talking about cyber disruptions, where can private sector and government work together to try and build in that resilience? So I turn it to you. Is there a Shields
Sure.
Up 2.0 that kind of leverages this elevated model?
Sure. I think so. I think so for a couple of reasons. And I say this with all due respect to my colleagues back in the intelligence community and law enforcement communities. I say this without reservation. Some of the brightest and most dedicated people I've ever worked with, and it's hard to replicate that kind of workforce outside of the government. The private sector understands industry better, understands its vulnerabilities better, and it needs to be the one that helps inform the government on where the fragility is, where the systemic risk is, both within a sector as well as across sectors. I advocate for an enterprise-wide view of the cyber risk to our critical infrastructure. So what do I mean by that? When there's a cyber event within a sector, obviously there's going to be big focus on bringing the sector back and making it whole again. Do we stop and think about what are the counterparty relationships that they have with other sectors, and how will they impact another sector when they take specific actions? So for example, this isn't cyber, but for example, on 9/11, when the towers came down, one of the first things that happened was the bridges and the roads and tunnels into lower Manhattan were shut off. Understandably, they needed to protect the ability for first responders, emergency equipment to get into the city. What they didn't realize when they did that was they also cut off the Federal Reserve's access to dollar bills. Even though the Federal Reserve is in New York City proper, they store the currency out in East Rutherford, New Jersey, and they could not get currency into lower Manhattan. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but the fact is we were in the middle of the largest terrorist event in our country's history. People were understandably rattled. I had family members down there. I know personally how rattled they were. And what if there had been a run on the ATMs? What if people had panicked and the ATMs didn't have cash in them? There would have been a greater challenge for maintaining civil control in the city. Now, thankfully, it didn't happen. And thankfully, we learned from that, and cash is stored in New York City now. But we need to work out and figure out where those interdependencies are, particularly in a cyber event before they happen. And when I was at the Treasury Department, Treasury did an excellent job of running some tabletop exercises for the financial sector, bringing in financial sector regulators, law enforcement, intel, policy, and even conducted one internationally. But to help people see where those expectations were, where assumptions were, what would really happen in the event of a cyber attack. And I think that the private sector and the government need to come together and have those kinds of exercises and those kinds of conversations in a cross-sector way.
Thank you for that. And if anyone has a question for Leslie, we'll keep an eye on the chat over there. I'll go ahead and tee one up. We've heard this morning that getting the regulatory agencies almost on the same page so that critical infrastructure partners that share multi-sector don't have different rules of the road, and as the global partners were highlighted, we'll always have different masters when it comes to regulatory bodies overseas. Do you see good progress there from the regulatory agencies to try and get a little bit more of cybersecurity in place, or anything that you might advise in that sector?
So, you know, two areas come to mind. If you look at the SEC proposed rules, both for notification of material breach and congressional legislation requiring critical infrastructure organizations to notify CISA of both breaches and of ransomware payments, I think they could be better harmonized. I think you could end up with companies and their legal departments wrestling with how do they respond to this? Who is the first? Who is the primary regulator, if you will, that they need to be concerned about? And if you're a global company, you've got to think about what global regulators are expecting of you as well. I think that I know the SEC put that out there for a couple of months dialogue. I haven't followed up and focused on where they've ended up with the rulemaking, but I think that dialogue is an important one to have within the government and then more broadly with the private sector.
Well, I for one appreciate your insight on all of this, and thank you so much for today. We don't have any questions in the chat box. I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne here, who's joining us.
Okay.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. I do feel like, you know, there's tremendous value in the fact that the panelists are listening to each other this afternoon and asking each other questions. We're going to all benefit tremendously for that. And Leslie, fantastic insights from both your experience in government and the private sector. So I just want to thank you both.